first things first is that the banks are experiencing, here's this word, unprecedented demand. And this is on the back of the fact that several of the larger banks also had offshore processing. COVID's changed all that. They've now brought that back on board. They have really been spinning their wheels for months and months and months in terms of trying to keep up with the level of demand, whilst also managing all of those mortgage deferrals and that type of work that they've been doing as well. So that has resulted in a pretty heavy backlog of work that needs to be done with the bank to be able to get a pre-approval. In some cases, some banks are even saying that they won't issue a pre-approval through a broker because unless you've got a bona fide sale or a contract in front of them, will they actually do that? And so we are seeing and experiencing banks who are saying it's going to take up to 18 days or 25 days to pick up some files. With that in context, when you do speak to your investment savvy mortgage broker, they are going to talk you through that process. Whilst we always say interest rate is important under best interest duty, the conversation that you may be having from an investor's point of view could also be around the speed at which your application can be processed, so you can actually have a fair shot at the property in question that you're going to be buying. That is quite important as part of the work that the broker's doing under their new obligations, which is best interest duty. The other thing that will slow you down is if you don't have your paperwork in order. So nothing's more frustrating than to provide a checklist to a prospective buyer and then basically taking 2 weeks to send all the paperwork or giving it to you in fits and spurts. It's really important that you have all of that paperwork, because a file that's going to be picked up, an application that's going to be picked up by a credit assessor, if for some reason it is missing information, that will go into a huge pile of loans or applications that are missing information. So we need to make sure that you absolutely put a clear application together so there's no second questioning of that. Because if the credit assessor says, I need to find out more information, it might be 7 days before they pick that file up again because of the amount of work that they've got to do. When it comes to if you're releasing equity from an existing property, valuations are going to be important. Now, at the moment, valuers are still putting information in there around the uncertainty of COVID and probably putting in some risk rating around COVID and the uncertainty. It'll probably take about a month or two before the valuers start to be more realistic about what true valuations are on these properties, because they're waiting for those settlements to take place, as opposed to just having hearsay in terms of, one Smith Street sold for $1 million, so that's why my property's worth $1 million. But that is going to take some time. So if you are going to be releasing equity out of a property through a refinance and a pre-approval, you are talking of at least a couple of months for that process to potentially play itself out. So I'm just forewarning you. Now, there might be some lenders who are doing it quicker. That's when you can have the conversation with your investment savvy mortgage broker around what that looks like. But that is going to be a critical part. The other thing we come back to, and I'll give Bryce a shot at the title in a minute, cash flow management, buffers. So again, we want to make sure that you're not stretching yourself too far. You're holding this property for the long term. There are going to be things that potentially come up in your life, such as children, school fees, which may eat into cash flows. Some loans coming out of interest only to principal and interest, so managing all of those types of things, but just making sure you've got that adequate buffer, because again, we don't want to see people just rushing in with this FOMO expectation that it needs to happen now. It's going to be important to do that type of work.
People need to be aware that if you're running really thin LVRs, if you're at 90%, just have an awareness around that if the valuation comes in low, you've got a choice to make, right? If you're lucky enough to be subject to conditions that allow you to get out, great. But if you're not, if you don't have a buffer, you're in trouble there. And that's not to say that you've paid too much. What it is that you've got 20 people all interested, 11 offers. Yours was $2,000 more than the person who was underneath you, and there's probably 4 backup contracts, within $5,000. But the valuers don't have the comparable sales to actually back up the price at some point. Now, most valuers that we've chatted to, their goal is to come in at contract price unless there's serious red flags. But in this market, it is hot. You might be getting conservative valuers. So that's important that you have the buffer that Ben talked about before. And if you don't, if you're chasing hard, that is something that you need to be aware of in this market, that may be the case. And it may be an oxymoron that you need to put in a condition that actually protects you from that. But that condition also is the reason why you don't get the property. So there is a balancing act that you need to play here. If you've had a pre-approval done with your mortgage broker or your bank, and that was late last year and you haven't had a conversation with them, you need to have a conversation with them at the very least at the 11th hour before you put in an offer, but don't have a conversation with them after you've put in an offer, because you absolutely need to shore up your finance. You need to make sure it hasn't changed. I know they sometimes feel inhuman, but banks are full of humans. A real person is going to pick up your file and they're going to see if you've given everything you need for them to make an assessment. If you haven't, then it's just going to be, I'm just going to put that on the pile and deal with it later. It needs to be clean.
They're triaging deals. So there's the same way in a situation where you've got too much work and you need to prioritize your order. The triage goes like this. First of all, pre-approvals get triaged away because you don't know how active they are going to be. And obviously they last for 90 days. So you've got to keep getting another pre-approval under the current rules of responsible lending. Then it's purchase is always number one. So if there's a purchase contract, that will go straight to the top of the queue to make sure that gets done. Now, that said, if you're trying to get a shorter settlement, they will be really tricky and you may be late on settlement. Now, that's the last thing you want to do in some cities and some states. If you are late on settlement, they can potentially void the contract, especially Queensland are very good at that. If they think they can get another buyer who wants to pay more a month down the track because you weren't able to get settlement done. So it's really important that you talk to your broker about confidence around 30-day settlements. Anything shorter than that, in reality, you need to probably have big lines of credit or not have to worry about waiting for the bank to get to that particular thing, because it does come back to that triaging of what they're going to do. Now, if they've got to triage a refinance before a purchase, that refinance is basically still sitting in a queue, and that's where it becomes really, really challenging. So we're just sort of giving everyone a warning around the banks are experiencing this high level of demand in a COVID or pandemic environment where they're also juggling other elements of their business. So some consideration around that in your preparation and your timing will be really, really important, because we do know that when you do have confidence in your finance, the terms that you're going to be using, and we'll be talking about offer in next week's show, but having confidence around your finance where you may not have to be subject to finance is going to be one of those things that allows you to act at speed, which is what Bryce was telling you about earlier. So that's an important one.